Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have back on the show, Margot Paez. I love chatting with Margot, all things progressive politics, the environment, Bitcoin mining, and a lot of you all listening to the show will know Margot and really enjoy hearing from her and her insights. She does a lot of research and work for the Bitcoin Policy Institute. She's going through her PhD thesis focusing on Bitcoin mining now currently and doing a lot of research behind the scenes, which hopefully in the next few months we'll be able to start seeing more of her research and papers coming out. So she's in the thick of it right now, which is why I was really honored that she would come on the show and kind of take a break from some of her work to just chat about things in the Bitcoin space right now. So we get into a lot of things focusing on politics, focusing on regulatory environment, focusing on the upcoming election, focusing on Bitcoin mining, and focusing on using Bitcoin in places where it's really, really needed, and some positive messages about no matter what happens with Bitcoin at a regulatory landscape or with different nations, the Bitcoin is here and the Bitcoin network continues and survives, even in places like Palestine, where we cover a geyser fund that's used to support families and those that need food and basic essentials in Palestine through Yusuf's fundraiser, which I will put. The geyser fund is in the show notes for folks to check out, and please support Yusuf's fundraisers for Palestinian families and just supporting families that really, really need this in the face of war. So Yusuf's been able to collect Bitcoin and send out basic provisions, food, and clothing and different things like that in Palestine to these families. So you can check out that geyser fund that are in the show notes below. And that is a perfect example of Bitcoin for human rights and Bitcoin doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is money separate from the state. You don't have to wait for NGOs to be given permission to go into places. Bitcoin is borderless. Bitcoin is being used for human rights and human flourishing in these areas. So please check out that fundraiser and donate any sats that you can. And we'll be posting a lot more about that fundraiser throughout our socials as well. So please share with your friends and family as well. And I was talking with Margot about this. Even if your friends or family don't really know about Bitcoin or send sats, or you don't, I would encourage you to explore how to send sats and do things like that. But you could also collect cash through Venmo or whatever, Cash App, from family and friends, and then you can send sats on their behalf to Yusuf's fundraiser. That's also another cool way to have them feel their impact in this conflict, and is a really good place to be able to have conversation with people about what Bitcoin is doing. Like, Bitcoin isn't just number go up, Wall Street, crypto. Bitcoin is human rights and freedom money that is borderless. And that's why we're here doing what we're doing, to share stories like that. So anyway, I want to thank Margot for coming on the show and having a great conversation as always, and really hope you all enjoy this conversation as well. If you have any questions or any feedback for me, you can always reach out to me at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. And as always, please feel free to check out our promo links to Saz Mining to get $50 off each and every miner that you purchase, and Bitbox, my favorite Bitcoin hardware wallet, to get 5% off orders there. And also new, I should mention, it's been out a few weeks at this point of this show, but we have a new Substack. So if you'd like, that's also in the show notes. You can subscribe to our Substack. There's a weekly newsletter that we're putting out, the TPB Weekly Digest, that sums up Bitcoin news from around the world and focuses on some stories that cover things like human rights, environment, all the stuff that we love to cover in this show, and sums it up nicely, delivered right to your inbox every Friday, maybe Saturday, depending if you're our Australia or New Zealand listeners, depending on the timing of things like that. So you'll get our episodes delivered every Tuesday to your inbox, and that newsletter every Friday, and it's completely free. I want you all to take advantage of that, share that as well for anybody that might be interested. So check out our Substack, please. All right, I will let you get to the episode now, and we will see you again next week. Hey, Margot, welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner. How are you?
Thank you. I'm good, I think. I've been really busy. I haven't had a chance to really check in with myself, but I think I'm good.
Well, maybe let's do that now. We'll do some breathing exercises to start the podcast, some 1 through 10. Why don't you tell folks what are, whatever you feel comfortable sharing, what are some of the things that you've been up to? I know you've been pretty busy with research and things like that, and in the midst of a bunch of different projects. But whatever you want to fill people in on, what are some of the things that you've been kind of thinking through and working on?
I've been working on a lot, a lot of
Yeah.
stuff for BPI, for the Bitcoin Policy Institute, where I'm a fellow and have been a fellow since January of 2022. So almost 2 years going
Wow.
as a fellow there. It's exciting. I have like three reports that I have in the pipeline. One is this big policy report that we've been collecting data for. So it's just been 3 months or so of working with the industry, trying to get them to share certain data with us so that we can do this study that we can include in the policy report. Because the biggest ask that we're getting from policymakers and their staffers is that they need data. They know what the talking points are, but they don't have data. So they can't really do much with that. So we're trying to provide some data for them. But it's been challenging to get data from the industry, which is no surprise, or is not such a surprise now, the more that I've read about the challenges with data center data in general. So yeah, it's a lot of work, but we're making progress there. And then I have this outline for a policy report on using flared gas for Bitcoin mining. And I also have my response to that UN university study that came out, I think, in October, and it's being reviewed right now. So I'm hoping to get some good feedback on that. It's just really long. It's at 21 pages right now, and I'm about 95% done with it. And there's like 7,100 plus words, and there's figures. I went really deep and technical. So yeah, we'll see how that goes, but it'll get published at some point. So looking forward to that. So that's the three things through BPI that I've been working on. And then I'm also working on the PhD thesis side, which is also on Bitcoin mining. And I've been working on a paper, and I also need to collect data for that and from the industry. Really, I started with, like, I think anybody who goes into your PhD thesis with big ideas, big grand ideas, and then my experience with collecting this data has been really informative in the sense of the challenges. And then it pushed me to look more at the data center literature, because there's a lot of overlap. There are key differences, but there's a lot of overlap. And a lot of the challenges with the Bitcoin mining research are also the same challenges that are faced in data center studies. So that started to give me some good perspective on what we really needed. And so I'm working on trying to get more of that bottom-up data, which will hopefully then better inform energy models like the Cambridge, energy consumption index, right? So maybe maybe have more bottom-up data so that it's harder for these papers like this UN university study or like the DeVries papers, maybe to make it harder for those to happen. Although no guarantee, because literally the data center studies literature suffers from the same problems and also spurs really bad news articles. So it's a lot of what we've seen in data centers is happening now. And I came across, and I'll just wrap this up, but I came across this study from like 2014. And literally, you could just take the word data center out and put Bitcoin mining, and it would sound very familiar. So, yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing how there's, at least a decade's worth of research done and a lot of good work done on trying to improve this type of modeling. And still, with Bitcoin mining in 2023, we are still seeing really terrible studies that then get picked up in the news and are clickbait, and then starts, getting policymakers and environmentalists concerned and freaking out and making bad policy. So that's the big challenge. That's what I'm trying to work on, is just to try to get a balance and get people to realize, it's not that bad. And also you just don't have the data. So you really have no right to make policy right now, other than to like, make policy to fund more research, I think.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, no, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And on behalf of like so many, thank you for doing that. Like sometimes like boring and laborious work, or sometimes I'm sure on your end, I feel like you expressed it before as well, just like, oh my gosh, like where do I begin with how inaccurate this is? But you taking the time to actually go through this because someone has to, right? Like people have to, like this small movement of like, for lack of better terms, like Bitcoin environmentalists, like people in the space, like engineers, miners, environmentalists, climate activists, chipping away at this stuff. And I know, like, even I've felt this, and I've only been, well, now it'll be about 3 years in a couple of months since I really jumped down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. But sometimes I take a step back and I'm like, okay, we've got another like 5, 10 years, on some of these narrative shifts and things like that. And it's like, all right, just keep going, just keep kind of taking those steps. And, it's that balance of being data focused and research focused. So you don't sound too much like a greenwasher or
Yeah.
evangelist. And, and I was talking with Daniel Batten about this recently on this podcast and offline as well. Like he's so focused on data because sometimes we might know this in the back of our head, but you put out kind of someone might put out a lazy report or a lazy rebuttal or something, and if you don't include critical data, that person is looking for you to fail or looking for ways that that's not accurate. So we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard than they would with these reports and papers like that. And I know that's exhausting and it's not fair and all of that, but it's the right thing to do. And I think you and several others are taking that approach. So thank you, because I know that's a lot. That can just be a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. It's called Brandolini's Law, and
Mm,
it's pretty accurate. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've written maybe double of what that UN university paper wrote in
yeah.
their commentary, and I think I have more figures. I had in the teens the number of figures. I think they had like
Mhm.
3 or 4 figures. So yeah, it's really hard uh, when these ridiculous papers get published and taken seriously. It takes a lot of work to debunk them and educate people as to why they should be debunked and should not be taken seriously.
One other question I want to ask you too, and I mean, a lot of people will already know who you are that are listening to this podcast, and we'll include like show notes and all that stuff. So I won't make you do like a boring intro or anything. And folks can listen back to our other episode from this summer. But in terms of where you find yourself, the work you're doing, the research, do you feel like internally, personally, you're finding more of a home in this being your, I hate the word, but maybe like calling and things like that. I know you've been doing this for a while, right? But I mean, you've told your personal story before on so many different avenues of just your own thesis experience previously and different educational journeys, and even starting out with like Occupy movements and just all of these different conflating factors. Where do you find yourself today, thinking about Bitcoin mining? Your experience being a progressive person from the left, environmentalist, all of these things. How you feel today with what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, I'm overall a lot happier than I was even at the start of this year. I mean, really a year
Yeah, that's
ago.
awesome to hear.
I mean, a
Yeah.
year ago, I was about ready, and I don't think people really know this, but I was really about ready to give up all of the work that I was doing on Bitcoin to please my old advisor. And I
Yeah.
literally told him that. And I went home for over the winter break, and was extremely, extremely depressed.
Mm.
And I went through my brown painting period, and
Oh,
everything was in brown, was like in raw
oh.
umber or something.
Mm.
And then thankfully the most horrible thing happened, and it completely changed my life. And yeah, I'm a lot happier every day I work on Bitcoin, whether it's for my PhD research or it's for BPI. I don't make a lot of money. My student debt is piling up, but
Mhm.
I'm happy. I get to work on things that I care about. And I think in a way, it's probably the first time where everything has aligned in that sense, where the things that I care about are my main focus and my main source of income. And I just think it's really great, and I feel really lucky that I get to do that. And I never, I mean, if you asked me in 2011, this 20 something year old with a microphone that who everybody thought was in high school doing a high school journalism project, if I would be doing this in 2023, I would say, what? I mean, I know what Bitcoin is, but I mean, why would I do that? I don't even care about money.
Yeah.
Down with money.
Right. Yeah. You would have been like, that sounds like the last thing I'd be doing.
Yeah, why money?
Yeah.
But then if you probably explained it to me, they'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, that's cool. But at the time, no, it was the last thing I was thinking about.
Yeah, well, I'm so happy for you. I'm so happy to hear that. And that's a theme that comes up a lot, whether I'm talking with someone on this podcast or offline, is like, I think getting into like Bitcoin or whatever after that, I think it can leave people with a little bit of hope, a little bit of passion that they infuse that into whatever area of their life makes sense, whether it's like doing a podcast or doing research or doing it as their job or feeling more secure with some element in their life or more satisfaction of like, yeah, we're going to bring down these like Wall Street assholes or, whatever it may be, in so many different fronts. I think it's a whole other element to Bitcoin and those of us that are in it. It's like, the world's pretty bleak, but there are fewer and fewer things these days. I don't want to make it sound too bleak that give me hope, and Bitcoin's one of them. And I'm the first person to say it's not one of those things that solves everything for sure. But finding hope in something and being like, just saying what you said, like I'm happier today than like I have been, and I can remember, is incredible. And that's what I hope for people too. That listen to these episodes, listen to people that I think are inspiring to a lot of people like yourself. I think a lot of people are inspired by you because they've heard your story before. I think your episode with Peter is still so good. Like probably one of the first, was that the first podcast you had done? Maybe, I'm not sure.
It was my
Like in this
second
realm.
one, but it was
Okay.
definitely the biggest.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was foundational for me. I was like, this person from like talking about Occupy and talking about Bitcoin. And I had kind of been around Bitcoin and kind of connect the dots already, but doing that and then you being this like unsung hero for like research and environmentalists and Bitcoin mining and kind of spearheading a lot of that movement along with others and Troy Cross, like I think people are just like, yeah, like we're gonna when Margot says something, we're gonna listen. So you have a lot of people that are fangirling, fan guying, I don't know, listening to you on this podcast right now. So no pressure. But I think it's great. In talking with you too, I've had a few guests like this recently where in talking with you, I'm like, the conversation can go in any number of directions. But a lot of times too, I never overestimate how many folks that are truly Bitcoiners, truly like, and this sounds like I'm trying to like label people, but really like understand progressive left stuff and things like that I'm able to have a conversation with on this. That still to this day it's so difficult and it's a growing niche, but it's still such a niche. Like this whole like left and Bitcoin and just we're still having some of the same conversations with different folks about how that even makes sense. It's better than it was, but it's a slow moving, slow turning, slow evolving thing. But for you, that's definitely one of the things I wanted to get into was, we're even closer. And I know our last episode I think was a good refresher on, I think a lot of probably your views and inspirations, like from the left and different thought leaders, regardless of like left, different thought leaders that you find inspiration in, what progressive is, what left is, all of that stuff that I would encourage people to listen to if they haven't. I think for this one, for me, my mind is much more on, we're getting very close. It'll be very close once this episode comes out to 2024, a new year, where I think there's already a lot of buzz around Bitcoin, just the price action that's going to continue to grow. There's a lot more mainstream focus on Bitcoin again. That's going to continue to grow, and there's this giant political election that is like the most messy and confusing thing. Like I'm 30, so I'm like I haven't seen too many, but like I've been like a political nerd since like high school, and just even historically thinking back, um, I have no idea what's going to happen or what's like going on with this. So is that something you even find yourself caring about anymore? Because so many of my progressive and left friends have just like they've tapped out. or they're just like, or they're super gung ho on certain initiatives. But in terms of any political candidate or political party or just the election in general, they're just like, I don't know. Like, I think that's a huge opportunity for us progressive Bitcoiners, but in general, it's like, I don't even know what to think about it coming up.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of us feel that way. I think like I've always been interested in politics, and I thank my dad for that. Gave me a good early education, and writing. I think about the Iraq War in high school and
Mm.
things like that. So yeah.
Was your dad pretty politically involved? I mean, you don't have to go into a whole story, but yeah, you drew inspiration from him in what ways?
Oh, well, my dad, yeah, he was involved in the civil rights movement and
Mm.
the war movement against the Vietnam War. So I grew up knowing these things about him and his activism, stuff he did with students at his campus, the college where he taught,
Mhm.
and uh, and then he would make me read little articles and about civilizations, and he used to talk about like a clash of civilizations, which I think is really interesting because this has started to come up, like especially with like Bush, when W. Bush came to office, and
Mhm.
this whole like battle of the West versus Islam, and
Yeah.
Islamic terrorism, and I started seeing that creep up on the right. So I felt like, oh, I have a background on what this idea is. So it's not
Mhm.
a new idea, and and then yeah, and I mean he taught me about the difference between empire and nation, and the importance of nation building and what that looks like, and I
Mhm.
thought that was really foundational for me as well in my outlook. And the first protest I went to was against the Iraq War with my dad. So
Wow. You were one of the I forget. I just finished um I had started a while ago and then just finished it, but like Turning Points on Netflix, the like 9/11 documentary. I don't know if you've seen it. It's actually I thought it was really good. It's very like mainstream accessible, but I thought it was fantastic. I mean, it covered there's like 5 different episodes. It covered like 9/11, then talked about the history of Afghanistan from the 70s and Soviet support on
yeah,
through. Talked about the Iraq War. Talked about so many things. And I just think it did a really good job of people watching that and just showing clips of leaders lying, but
mhm.
compiling it, lying over years, but compiling it into like 20 minutes of one
Oh,
episode
that's
was
great.
pretty like, wow. For everyone. And most Americans, most people are, I would say, on the same page with this at this point. Like it was, we shouldn't have done it. All of this. But at the time, you and your father would have been one of the few outspoken Americans. I don't want to say the exact amount, but it was probably like definitely no more than 20%, maybe 10%, depending on the year, but definitely early on,
Yeah.
very much the vast majority of
Oh, I
Americans were like,
remember.
let's go burn the rest of the world down if we need to.
I remember it was really bad to be against the war. And
Hmm.
I knew very few people who were against it early on in the early year, like first year or
Hmm.
a couple years or so. And like I had teachers who were like, no, we got to do this. Got to go get Osama. And I'm like, no, this is terrible. This is a mistake.
Hmm.
So yeah, so I saw that. It's hard to forget that that was really transformative, I think, for myself at that age, just starting to really understand the world and
Hmm.
the politics and how politicians behaved, and
Hmm.
I think it's been a really interesting trajectory or just progression for me to see, how some politicians come into favor and then out of favor. Because I remember at that age thinking Nancy Pelosi was really great because she opposed the Iraq War,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
remembering all the different politicians in the Democratic Party who were opposed to the war. And it's around that time that I first heard about Bernie Sanders, because he was one of the
Hmm.
few early on who opposed the war. And then later on, you start seeing their other positions, and you're like, oh, this person's
Yeah.
terrible, and then you realize, oh, they just take a political stance in this way because they want to be in opposition to the opposing party, the Republican Party. And it's not that they
Yeah.
actually care, it's just that they want votes. And so that to me was really enlightening, and also, made me, I suppose, more cynical about the way our political system works. And yeah, so my dad gave me a really great foundation for my political views. So I really can't say that I came across these ideas all on my own. I mean, he gave me a foundation and then I built on it. But other people, I don't know, they, one way or another, they end up in this worldview. But I inherited it from my dad.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast, and I'm really excited about this new partnership. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. When you think about like elections and stuff, and when I talk with certain people, like even now I have in the back of my head, okay, do we need to focus on one topic or a Bitcoin or this and that? I'm just talking with you. Like for this upcoming election, because the Democrats have said this constantly about Donald Trump, but it's constantly been said in other elections as well, that it's in a fight for our democracy, like all is lost, like this and that. Like, how do you view that sort of rhetoric going into an election like this? Is there anything that you feel about this pivotal moment in history, like going into elections like this, and not necessarily Donald Trump, just like where we're at in history? We'll talk about some of the global things going on, just everything that's happening around the world. Going into, unfortunately, the U.S. is a very important country and kind of like has a lot of say in world affairs, regardless whether that's good or bad. So these elections matter in that extent. So how do you view this going into this year? Do you feel like this is a monumental moment? Do you think it is not much will change regardless? Like, how do you view some of these things?
Yeah, this has been hard because I feel like there's really a generational divide in terms of concerns around what matters in this election or even in the 2020 election. And I see my older friends who are, they're like Gen X, but, closer, on the closer towards the boomer side of Gen X, I think. And, that like they're really all they care about is Trump's going to destroy democracy and you got to stop that. And I feel really disconnected from that. For me, that I feel like, well, democracy already doesn't work. And I think either party has an authoritarian strain to it. It's not just like your classic fascism. I think that the Democrats are also not particularly in favor of democracy either to a certain degree. So I don't know. I mean, is it a battle for democracy? I mean, it's not all in the executive branch, for one thing. There's a lot of democracy that has already been lost, and I don't know that reelecting Joe Biden is going to get that back, for people. I see Biden's behavior and political choices on the global stage as being not necessarily much better than Donald Trump. Biden didn't. I think Kamala Harris maybe went to COP28. Biden didn't go, and I mean, okay, so we're back in the Paris Climate Accord, but even 1.5C is dead, and that the rate we're going 2C is dead as well. So, what hope is there? And Trump being in office, well, would that really change that trajectory? I don't think so. I think that neither of them are going to do it. I mean, I really struggle with this because I really don't want to vote for Joe Biden. And I think the Democratic Party has basically taken away our democratic right to decide who should be nominated. So it's hard for me to feel like this is a Democratic Party, like a small d Democratic Party. There will be no primary debates. There's been these Republican primary debates going on all this time and not a single one, because the DNC decided that Joe Biden couldn't handle the heat. And so we have been denied an opportunity to decide whether he should run again. And I think most young people don't want to see him run again. And I think he's too old. So no, it's really hard to feel that, like you're really passionate about this idea that this is it, democracy will be lost now or never. I mean, they said sort of the same thing last time, and they also claimed they were going to do all this stuff with COVID, and that they completely abandoned that, and they were going to do all this stuff with climate, and they completely abandoned that. And instead, I was just reading an article that said that oil prices might crash next year because the U.S. production is so high right now, and that it's there's basically too much supply compared to what OPEC was prepared for in setting prices. So, are we really serious about climate change, about reducing our emissions? I mean, I don't see that that's happening under Joe Biden, and the guy barely even talks about climate change. So this is a really long answer. It's just to say, the short answer is it's difficult. I don't know. I'm not happy either way. I feel like we're constantly being abused by our politicians, and sometimes I think maybe we have to just say no and deal with the consequences to get the message across that they have to stop abusing us in this way, abusing their voters by them basically holding us hostage and saying, if you don't vote for me, I'm going to destroy the republic, which I think is what is happening. Democratic Party is holding us hostage, saying we have to vote for this corporate Democrat who's a neoliberal,
who might not make it to the election.
Through
like literally
term. Yeah. And then we're gonna have Kamala Harris. Like, God, that sounds awful. The person who got
she's less popular than Hillary Clinton.
Like 2% of the vote during the primaries. That's not representative. So not. I don't feel like playing that game anymore. So I guess that's where I stand. I don't want to play the game anymore.
No, and the reason I asked you too, it really wasn't a leading question. I was just curious. I think there's so many like listeners that will start trickling into the pod and have already that are like, because yes, I like Bitcoin. It's Progressive Bitcoiner. It's like a a Bitcoin focused podcast. But a lot of the reason I got into Bitcoin because I was a disenfranchised, that's the wrong term, just frustrated progressive that didn't know where to turn. And I'm just like, nothing is like working. And then I feel that even more so now with Joe Biden and kind of seeing this through. Really post Bernie, I was feeling that. And I've talked about that a lot. Logan and I, who have an episode coming out, talked about that because Logan wrote a great article about from Bernie to Bitcoin. So a lot of the progressives that are in Bitcoin, we are previous like Bernie bros or whatever.
Definitely
so for me,
here.
So for me, like Bitcoin was like, okay, I can maybe start finding some solutions because that definitely is dead. That kind of political movement, movements of people are always possible. Like that's where I find hope. It is always like, where there's a will, there's a way with people always. But in terms of political parties, individuals, you mentioned like Nancy Pelosi and others, right? It's kind of like, yeah, unfortunately, I agree 100% with you. It was in opposition to the leading party. Well, the Democrats have been the leading party for a while now in so many ways, and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely, and it's hard not to see that true today. So I think there's a lot of people that will be listening that are looking for different. I don't want to say looking for answers because this podcast I don't think is like for answers. I think it's to ask more questions and to try to find solutions and to be creative about that. And that's one way Bitcoin does that. But even aside from that, a lot of Bitcoiners and people like yourself are asking these important questions and kind of involved in things that hopefully really will make a difference in the world. Because I think that's probably why we're here, is like we want to make a difference in the world. That's why we're doing this. It's not for anything else. Like I'm not gonna. There's other like finance podcasts that'll talk about Bitcoin differently. There's other like, it's like we want to make a difference in the world, and that's why we're here doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think coming to Bitcoin is really happens at a point where you realize that mainstream politics don't work and you have to find another way to make a difference in the world. And the only other way to do it is really at the grassroots level through direct action. And Bitcoin is a form of direct action. And and you are, by holding Bitcoin, by running a node, by buying things with Bitcoin, you're doing a political act. It really is, because you decided to do something that was outside of the existing financial system to a certain degree, and you did it consciously. So that's a political choice that you've made, and you've done it probably because you find it appealing that there's nobody stopping you from doing it. There's nobody that can stop you from sending Bitcoin or receiving Bitcoin. And I think that's really powerful at a time where I think a lot of people feel powerless. You do have a powerful option in Bitcoin. And so I think also that, that's where the hope comes from. And I think also where the kind of cult aspect comes into, because it's really different. It's different from what our normal day-to-day life is, where there's all sorts of rules and barriers and hoops that you have to jump through, and you don't really have to do that with Bitcoin. So I think suddenly you see a lot of opportunities and a lot of possibilities that you didn't see before through Bitcoin because of that. And that ability to not have to ask permission, I think is really powerful, and does make you think about the world in a different way. Why do we have to ask permission to do certain things? Why is there so much surveillance? And then we start talking about CBDCs, and that goes down a whole other path too of government control and authoritarianism. And I think a lot of Bitcoiners are worried about that. And if you can't stop it from happening, then what are the tools that you need to protect yourself in a scenario like that? And Bitcoin is going to be really important, because even though, on the left, we don't really like to talk about money or, finance too much,
wealth,
that's all kind of like things that we don't really talk about because it seems capitalistic. But the reality is we live in a capitalist society, or something like it. If you're like Yanis Varoufakis, then it's not even capitalism anymore. We're in this like techno feudalism. So if you live in a techno feudalistic society, well, then that kind of means that you have ownership of nothing. You will have nothing and be happy, right? So what's one way to stop that? Own Bitcoin, right? So yeah, you do have to think in financial terms. You can still hold on to everything else that you believe in: mutual aid, direct action, things like that, sharing, community, gifting, gift economy, whatever. I think all of that can coexist, understanding the scenarios that we face.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't even know what I'm talking about anymore.
No, you said so much for me to think about. I mean, the word that kept bringing out to me too is like, I think I get so in my head because there's so many different language models and so many things I'm trying to fit through. Like when I talk, like whether it's through this podcast or other avenues, I'm like, okay, progressives are usually triggered by X. Okay, Bitcoiners are not X the platform, just they're triggered by this thing.
Yeah.
Bitcoiners will be triggered by this. Like you can't be all things to everyone. Just me and the silly example is like a pod host, or just when you're talking with friends or family. I think just like owning yourself and also owning when you're using Bitcoin, it is countercultural. Like I'll give a little example. Like So the recent episode with Daniel Baden that I did, like on YouTube, it's the first one. It didn't really issue like a trigger warning, but it's the first one that mentioned climate change under. So
Oh
if you
yeah,
go on the
yeah,
YouTube video, it says climate change and it gives a definition of climate change.
yeah,
And I'm thinking back and I'm like, we're actually like talking about climate change, but it's just the fact that we're talking about Bitcoin mining and climate change. Like that is like, I'm so steeped in that world with you all. And I know that it's different from what people think, but when I'm even talking with family or friends about it, and I've found some like different ways to talk about it to where they're like, oh, interesting. Like I didn't know that. Like I found ways to talk about it where it's not just like repulsive, but in general, like literally our main, YouTube, mainstream media, governments, the world, it's definitely evolving in a positive way, but this is deeply countercultural to talk about Bitcoin mining in the environment. It's deeply countercultural to use Bitcoin as a payment rails. Like it's I will stand by and say it is very legal and constitutional. Like I'm definitely one of those people that's like, no, I will stand by this out in the open and say this is your right as an American, or this is your right in many nations around the world. I'm not going to steep down and say, okay, you need to do this in a cave in privacy. Like, no, I will say like loudly, this is your right and privilege, and we'll fight for that. But it's deeply countercultural, and I think people should own that, and know that coming into Bitcoin, if we're fully gonna utilize it and not be afraid to say that, because it is, I think, for good.
yeah. Absolutely, it's very countercultural. It's exciting to be at this stage. When I was younger, I wanted to be in the late '70s in Silicon Valley, you
Mm.
know, attending computer clubs and building the first personal computers at that time. And I was not alive then, so I missed
You
that.
missed it, yeah.
And this is my chance to experience that wonderful early stage of a new technology that is revolutionary.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's cool. Cool.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see the timeline on all of this. Obviously, Bitcoin's still really, really new and early. I think it's going to take an incredibly long time as well for something like this, if it's to be like global permissionless money. Like these type of things take a lot of time, but it will be very interesting to see. And I think, if I'm being honest, the one thing that does worry me a little bit, and I think, speaking of political landscape, regulatory, the one thing I think is clear to me is there are many, many people like the US, and everything it does for me personally is very deceptive. It's very like, whether it's like inflation, they're like it's not as bad, or whether it's like wars, well it's not really a war. It's like we're funding this and that, and they just kind of shady on a lot of different things. And they're very good about it. They're very good at that. They're very good at kicking the can down the road. Like these huge deficits we have, or these huge global conflicts, they're really good about being like, but we're the United States. It's going to be fine. Like it's always fine. It's going to be fine, whatever. And I'm not a doomsdayer here to say the world's going to end tomorrow, anything like that. But what I think will be interesting with Bitcoin, I think we're in that next phase of regulatory landscape, Bitcoin ETFs. I think a lot of people will buy into this regulatory notion of, well, I'm not going to use Bitcoin. I'm going to have this like Bitcoin ETF, and it's still good for my retirement. Part of me is like, hey, that's good. If a worker gets to benefit from price action and they have more retirement for their family, great. Like, who am I to say no? Screw that. You need to have like, your Raspberry Pi going right now and be mining in your home, right? I think there's different ways to talk about it, but I think some politicians or regulators are like, yes, this is great. This is exactly how we want 99% of the world to interact with Bitcoin, is through a regulated paper ETF, which is incredibly risky. Just in the face of like, look what happened in 2008, great financial crisis. Have we not learned anything? Trusting others. It's the complete antithesis to what Bitcoin is. I'm a bit worried that people are just like, oh, cool. Yeah, I have BT or Bitcoin in the ETF. And regulators are like, okay, so I don't see a direct, like, we're banning Bitcoin, happening in the United States at this point. I see it as we're going to package these different regulatory ETFs and things like that. And that's the way we're going to keep tabs on how people can use it, or different, laws that are coming through, and things like that. Um, is that something you think about, or you see as, oh, that's really terrible? That's really, it is what it is. How do you think about those things?
Yeah, constant conflict over that too.
Mhm.
Just no, I am not a fan of enriching the wealthiest
Yeah.
corporations in the world that really have the Federal Reserve chairman or chairperson on their speed dial.
Mhm.
These are people. Larry Fink is a highly influential person. He
Mhm.
literally has the most important people in government on speed dial, and
Yeah.
he knows it and he flaunts it. It's not a secret.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not really interested in further enriching the oligarchs or the plutocracy
Mhm.
or whatever. And so that does bother me. On the other hand, you can't stop anyone from using Bitcoin or using it in however way they want. It's an open protocol, it's an open network, anyone can participate. So kind of have to watch and see how that plays out. And
Yeah.
my hope is that people who need Bitcoin will use Bitcoin. And maybe that's the most important thing to keep in mind. If
Mhm.
they were to really regulate Bitcoin and say, well, only these miners, these types of mining will be, valid, and only these types of transactions will be valid, and only maybe
Mhm.
this kind of software will be valid on nodes. I mean, ultimately, you've just forked Bitcoin, created a new Bitcoin. Is
Yeah.
that really Bitcoin? Which one is the valid Bitcoin? So,
Mhm.
these are the kind of thoughts that I try to go through in my head. What
Yeah.
does that mean in the long term for Bitcoin? And I think ultimately, so long as there is a network that is being secured, whether it's being secured in the US or not, is irrelevant.
Mhm.
The US could ban Bitcoin mining tomorrow and it wouldn't matter. The
Yeah.
US could ban Bitcoin self custody tomorrow and it wouldn't matter.
Mhm.
And I think that's really important. The network still goes on. The only ways in which it does matter is if you worry about, adding to emissions. But even then, Bitcoin energy footprint is, fairly inconsequential in the long term, I
Mhm.
think, in the long term trajectory. So, it's not that important. I think the most important thing is that Bitcoin continues to live and that people who need it will find ways to use it in the same way that torrents still exist and Usenet still exists. You can still
Mhm.
download books for free. You can download software for free. You can download movies, music, whatever. You can find it for free on these distributed peer to peer networks. And there's
Mhm.
nothing the government can do to stop it other than for companies like Netflix and Disney and Paramount and so on, for them to provide high quality services that make people feel like they'd rather pay for it than go and download it.
Mhm. Yeah.
So there has to be this like competitive alternative that people would rather have, but that doesn't stop Bitcoin from existing. So when I think through that kind of process, I feel a little less triggered and think it's
Mhm.
okay because the I think where we can get triggered is the question of what is hyper Bitcoinization? What does that look like? And
Yeah.
is that necessary for Bitcoin's success? And I think that it's okay that if Bitcoin never becomes the standard in a way, if it's still just there and it still exists and people who need it can use it, then I'm still happy with that
Yeah.
outcome. So, but it's still really early. We're like you were saying, right? You think about like, oh, this still take will be like another 5 or 7 years, but I'm thinking like, you know, the issuance of Bitcoin, the final little bit,
2140, I think, or
2140.
something like that.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I was just telling
It's-
my I was just telling my
That's
PhD
crazy.
advisor about this. And, I was giving him a little. He he said he was at a cocktail party.
Yeah, give me a little lowdown on
Yeah.
that. Like how is that interaction? Because that's obviously got to be like point number one for you is like how's this gonna be compared to last time?
Well, I'm an extraordinarily traumatized PhD student
Yeah.
who unfortunately had to start over in certain ways. But uh, I mean, my new advisor is amazing. I am not convinced that he's real
Yeah.
because
He might not be.
he's been so kind to me
Mhm.
and really generous and compassionate and patient, and I am not used to that. I'm used to being beaten by it with a stick and
Yeah. Yeah.
stay in there in that room and
Right.
wait.
Right.
I mean, not literally like that, but psychologically like
Yeah.
that. And yeah, I mean, I experienced some really horrible stuff. So yeah, but he's amazing, and he is open to the Bitcoin stuff. And apparently he was at a cocktail party, and some kind of inebriated guy wandered over to him and started talking to him about the white paper,
Mm.
and that the guy was like, "No, this is beautiful. It's like the most beautiful thing that I have ever read."
Was it Satoshi? Was it? Was it
It
Satoshi?
wasn't Satoshi, but I mean, he was talking about the white paper.
Yeah.
And my advisor said, "Okay, maybe, I really didn't want to, hear this for 30 minutes, but I thought maybe it would be helpful for me to help Margot with her research."
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was really sweet and unexpected,
Yeah.
that he's actually, trying to understand it on his own a
Mhm.
little. And yeah, he thinks it's cool. So, yeah, it's exciting to be able to work with somebody who is not telling me this is bad, we can't do this here, and
Yeah.
all sorts of other stuff. So I'm trying to adjust, but also not take his kindness and generosity for granted either.
That's good. Yeah, we're entering this interesting phase of like some, academics and researchers being, you would know this better than I would, but being more open to it or actually being the first ones in a room to talk about it sometimes. I think that's an interesting shift we've seen with some researchers, some actual papers that people could, people like you or Troy or others can actually point to and be like, oh no, that's legit. Like that's a legit like, research group or paper or source rather than no offense to them, they're great, but like Bitcoin Magazine or something like that, right? Being like, okay, we can't really cite this for some of this research.
Yeah.
Um, we've seen that more and more, which is very exciting.
Oh,
Because then
we've gotten a lot of papers out in this last year from Texas A&M from their research group, and they actually
yeah.
now they formed like a blockchain energy group, like
Oh,
legitimate
cool.
research
Okay.
group. And
Yeah.
I was at the North American Blockchain Summit
Hmm.
just before Thanksgiving. It was in Fort Worth, Texas, and there was a professor from Texas A&M there giving a talk, and he did a workshop, and he was talking about he was working more on the electrical engineering side
Hmm.
with the mining machines, and there's this voltage issue that is not a result of Bitcoin, but I guess it's something to do with how the electrical grid is set up, and so he's been doing
Hmm.
research on that. So I thought that was really cool, having an actual professor who's doing this research come to a Bitcoin conference and talk
Hmm.
about the research and be on panels. And yeah, it's a big step forward. It's really cool to see that engagement. And then we got another really cool paper that is not, it's in the preprint phase. So it's already been peer reviewed, but there's like
Hmm.
still like language or style editing that has to get done before it's officially published. But that paper was really fantastic because it just went through all of the energy research literature and just destroyed all of it
Yeah.
pretty almost, especially Alex DeVries' work.
Yeah.
And it's just so excellent. And then the nice thing is that these guys gave best practices as well. So now we have two papers that give best practices for doing this kind of research, which
Hmm.
really highlights the fact that there's no excuse going forward for bad research, because
Yeah.
if you're serious about this work, then you should have read those papers, and they would have stopped you
Yeah.
from publishing another DeVries style paper.
Yeah.
So hopefully, I'm hoping that we'll see more of that. Would be great. And then of course there's the Cornell paper that just came out as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that Cornell paper really has gone a long way, I think, because it has that stamp of an Ivy League on there too, and that gets a lot of
Hmm.
attention. You can't pretend that credentials and labels and institutions like that don't go far in this
Don't
kind of
matter. Yeah.
society. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty impressive to see that slow turnaround start to happen. And I also
Yeah.
think, Trey, that that's also why we're seeing a slightly different angle of attack now, which is this environmental footprint or water footprint, because I
Hmm.
think we did a really good job on the carbon side,
Yeah.
and that was
That's an
the
interesting
most
take.
that was
Yeah.
the most potent attack on the
Yeah.
network, which was on the emission side. And, it's not over. This battle isn't over,
Hmm.
or the war isn't over, but we did win. We made some big gains on
Yeah.
that. And the water side, that's not as strong, I think, and easier to refute, in a lot of
Hmm.
ways.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, so I think that's why we're seeing that. They need a new tactic. I guess, if we're cynical and conspiratorial, they
Hmm.
need a new tactic to take out Bitcoin on the
Yeah.
environmental side.
I mean, pretty
So
soon it'll come down to like, well, Margot, you like Bitcoin, so you're going to be biased. It's going to come down to like, because some I feel like some researchers, and me not being in the academic world, but just some researchers try to pretend they have a veil of ignorance, and they're like, well, I don't have this asset, or I don't believe in this. I have to articulate it from an opposing view, and that's the only credible way to approach it. So I feel like it'll just at some point just they're gonna just run out of arguments, right? But like you said, like these very like Cornell, others, like we're not greenwashing at this point. Like there are some articles written about Bitcoin that you kind of read it and say that sounds kind of greenwashy, or they didn't give specific details, or this and that. But it's like no, you have researchers combing through data, and the data is getting better month after month, that are actually doing legit research and science on this, and also giving ways for us to focus on how it can actually improve, because I think that's important too. Not just like, oh, Bitcoin's like 100% amazing all the time in every regard, also posing different thoughts, but getting through the misinformation first, I think is really important.
yeah, absolutely. And I remember saying this over a year ago, I guess now going on 2 years ago. And people would ask me, like, well, where's the evidence? Where's the proof that this is happening? I
Mhm.
said, look, we don't have the data yet. Give it 2 years, give it 2 or 3
Yeah.
years. And we're starting to get into that. And I think that's also why we're seeing the shifts, because we are starting to see more companies crop up. And in those
Mhm.
days, it was still like, yeah, they're coming online. They're trying to sign the deals. And I
Yeah.
know I've been told, but they're not
Yeah.
publicized
I mean,
yet.
most of the hashing was in China, so it was really difficult
Yeah.
to get a lot of the data before 2018, 2019 in any real ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's still hard, but the thing is
Yeah.
that now that so much of the hash rate has moved to the US, where we have
Mhm.
stronger, albeit insufficient climate policies and goals,
Yeah.
and a motivation to move in that direction, I think that it makes it a lot easier for this narrative to come about,
Mhm.
because we just, the companies are American companies. So the narrative is easier to pick up on and disseminate than if
Mhm.
it were, if all this were happening in Russia. I don't think we would have as easy of a time pushing that narrative, because we'd be in a state that's not very popular on the geopolitical front, in a language that most people don't speak. And yeah, so it was fortuitous that China banned Bitcoin. So really, everything that happens to Bitcoin is good for Bitcoin. I think
Yeah, it goes back to what you were saying. You're
I
like,
think it's
if the
good.
US bans Bitcoin, whatever that means or looks like,
Yeah.
the network goes on. And I feel like I constantly need to hear that. I'm so steeped in political angles of it, regulatory, because I think it's because I want the average everyday person in the US. Globally, I think it's happening. So I'm like, yes, let's ride that wave. And I think I need to echo that more. Just even saying that now, it's because I think that's already winning in so many ways. It's more like the average everyday American. like lower income America. I want people to have as easy of an access to holding their own Bitcoin private keys and running their own nodes and these things. So I focus on like, the regulatory stuff and thinking like, no, screw that. Like I want, Americans who can really utilize this to use it, not just in an ETF, or not just they have to have a Coinbase account or whatever it could look like in some dream scenario. I hope that doesn't happen, but you're right. The network's going to keep moving on. I mean, it it's a good metaphor, I think, a good enough, but it's like banning the internet. We already went through that. We already tried that. It doesn't work. Those other services you were talking about, those things still exist. Like
Yeah,
it is here. Um,
exactly. It's
yeah,
here. And that's
yeah,
what that's, that's the message I'm hearing. And I think, like, change the code. Everybody, or most people listening, are probably familiar with Greenpeace's Change the Code and the story
hmm,
around that. Chris Larson, CEO of Ripple, gave Greenpeace $5 million to run this campaign to try to get
yep,
Bitcoin to go proof of stake, which is just,
hmm,
there's already a Bitcoin proof of stake fork
yeah,
out there.
a
So if you want to use
few,
it,
yeah,
feel free, Greenpeace.
right, right,
But,
right,
they realize that they've run this campaign for a year and it's a failure. So, yeah, I think they're starting to also understand that Bitcoin is here to stay, which is what we've been saying. It's like, it's here to stay. So you really just need to figure out what can you do to make sure that Bitcoin does good things in the world and not bad things in the world.
yep,
And so I'm hoping that that is the path that they take going forward in 2024, is that they start, really seriously thinking, like, how can I be part of the solution,
hmm,
and how can Bitcoin be part of the solution, since it's not going to disappear anytime soon. They
yeah,
can't stop it. I think they're starting to realize finally Bitcoin is not going to die.
yeah.
And yeah, it's just not how it's going to be. So yeah, it's it's good to see that shift, but also scary at the same time. I'm like used to
Yeah.
being on the opposition side, on the defense.
There's been interesting conversations I've had with different people, with many different folks. I mean, I think I'm able to connect with some people too, a lot of times offline from some of these groups and things we're talking about, because I have a background in nonprofits, because I focus on so many different things that I'm like, that's why I'm in Bitcoin, guys. Like it wasn't the other way around. But yeah, I've noticed that shift, and I'm glad you brought it up. I was going to say it explicitly. It's like, yeah, change the code. I don't want to say it's a good thing. Like I'm gonna be like, whenever you get here, and that's great. Like I don't want to beat up on someone, after the fact, unless they're really just malintent, not in good faith, like whatever. But there's some people that'll, I'm not gonna look back and say, oh, your tweets 2 years ago were saying the opposite. Like, whatever. But yeah, it was change the code. And now you're seeing much more, and it's been this way for a while, but clean up Bitcoin. And I think now, many in the cleanup Bitcoin camp and movement are still kind of would like to see proof of stake, right? I don't want to say that they're all Bitcoiners now, but I think just that language shift, and they're not all the same folks. I don't want to say like change the code became that. It's kind of been kind of simultaneous, but clean up Bitcoin just objectively. I'm like, we can work with that. I can work with that in terms of like we actually are. Like, I will be the first to say there are some mining corporations, Bitcoin miners, that I think are doing things pretty good, environmentally conscious, and some that are not as good as others. They're not all equal, but that doesn't mean demonize a whole industry. That doesn't mean we need to get rid of and ban Bitcoin or it's useless, right? Those are two very different extremes. So if you're talking with someone and they're like, well, we need to clean up Bitcoin or we need to focus on more environmental stuff, that's where you can start pointing to data. That's where you can point saying, well, a lot of that work is already being done, and this is how we perceive it will continue to grow in that direction. That's where you can work with someone. If someone's saying, change the code, and then you look at who's funding that initiative and all these other things, I think there's the two very different things. So I think that's been a really welcome shift as well. And I'm going to assume in some regards it's good faith, and sometimes it's not. But when I hear clean up Bitcoin, I'm like, let's have a conversation. If I hear change the code, ban Bitcoin, Bitcoin shouldn't exist, well, that's tougher to have a conversation outright.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. for sure. It's a different, the language matters. Certain
Right.
languages way more confrontational than other. Clean up Bitcoin still pisses me off anyway.
Yeah, it's still like,
Although I
It's
get what you're
not,
saying, but I still
yeah,
am like, what do you mean clean up Bitcoin? What are you going to clean up? Like,
yeah.
what do you think
Yeah,
it
one of my first thoughts too is like clean up
doesn't?
every other industry on the planet compared to Bitcoin. Like, then you
I
get into
mean,
that.
yeah, of course, I agree with you. There are certain certain mining companies that I am constantly raising an eyebrow at,
Mhm.
but I think that there are also, but what impresses me is that I also consistently run into people who are trying to do good things and who are concerned about their environmental impact, their climate impact. They
Mhm.
understand that aspect of it, and so it's good to keep in mind that the industry is not monolith in terms of opinion on the issue, and yeah, in the past, for a variety of reasons, uh, people have taken up Bitcoin mining and used it in locations where they shouldn't have, and
Mhm.
that's something we have to acknowledge and have to think about. Well, why did that happen? And will
Yeah.
that happen again? And if there is a scenario in which that's possible, what can be done in those states to prevent that from happening again? And I think
Yeah.
it's the right of the people in these places to decide whether Bitcoin mining should happen or not. I think
Mhm.
this is a kind of a contrary opinion to some other people in the space, but I do think that they have a right at the local level to say, no, we really don't want a mining facility next to our church. You
Yeah.
know, why isn't that their right? Why? Because you lease the land, therefore you think that you own you have whatever,
Mhm.
you can do whatever you want. You
Yeah.
know, I don't think so. I don't think that that's how society should operate. But I guess maybe that's like a very anarcho-capitalist viewpoint, but from a left anarchist perspective, it's not okay. It's not okay.
Yeah.
The society, the people in that community have a right to decide whether you should be allowed to do that. And I think that that is their right, and they should. If they don't want it, then you shouldn't be there. And
Yeah.
I don't want to see legislation passed that hampers their ability to pass as a sound ordinance.
Yeah.
I'm really sensitive to noise. I'm paying a lot more money in rent just to live in a quieter part of the city
Mhm.
because I have a really hard time with noise from the streets,
Mhm.
street noise. And so I can completely sympathize with people who are complaining about noise nearby because yeah, those machines are loud, I'm sure.
Mhm.
At
Yeah.
a distance you can still hear those fans, and that if you move to a rural area, noise is the last thing you want in your town
Yeah.
because you moved out of the city for a reason. So people, I think miners should respect that and not put up a fight. And I think they really should do due diligence before they set up. Electricity shouldn't be
Mhm.
the only electricity cost shouldn't be the only factor. I mean, they should really be thinking about what is my impact on the local community, because that having a negative impact on the community leads to these news articles and then
Mhm.
gets used at the higher level. And Elizabeth Warren is running around, they're a
Yeah. And
nuisance.
then we're talking about the
Yeah.
wrong things because what you're talking about, and I agree, is, corporations. It's not about like Bitcoin. So then people will turn it into a Bitcoin environment, Bitcoin this, that. It's like, no, it's kind of a corporation just like any other deciding something. That's more of a capitalist structure, corporations and communities conversation. It just happens to be a Bitcoin miner, but you can insert any corporation XYZ into that same factor. It's the same type thing. So you're right. I think for better or for worse, Bitcoiners, Bitcoin companies have to be super aware because we're the new guys in town that have a bad reputation. You have to take that into extra consideration. And yes, you should do the right thing anyway. But even more so on top of that is because there's extra scrutiny on the industry, on Bitcoin, on these other things that folks have to really be aware of, rather than just saying, this is America, damn it, I can do what I want, or whatever the case is with some of these companies.
Was it like corporate civicism or something? I don't know. There's some corporate stewardism. There's some phrase around that means corporations, being part of the community and doing good things for the community. I'm seeing too many of these smaller Bitcoin miners that are not not playing a positive role in the community where they're setting up. There's just too many articles that come up with a noise complaint. I don't think that we should be seeing that many. It also says that fans are still really popular in these facilities, and they're not using immersion cooling. So I think there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of education to be done in that area. And I'm concerned that I'm hearing that certain legislation that was passed in the last year is actually hampering people at the county level or city level from passing noise ordinances. And I think that thus, like, the right to mine should not supersede the right to a peaceful life, a healthy life, because excess noise is detrimental to your health and can raise your blood pressure and anxiety and have all these additional effects. So I don't support passing laws that hamper another individual's right to decide whether they want to experience that. So that concerns me.
Yeah, well, this is a really good conversation too, because I think there's two extremes, right? It's kind of the extreme anti-Bitcoin, and there's the extreme, maybe folks feel like they have to protect Bitcoin at all costs or only talk about it positively, when what we're talking about is not Bitcoin, the open source protocol. We're talking about a Bitcoin mining company, or whatever. It's okay, like, Bitcoin can take it. We need to have these conversations at like a human and community level. Bitcoiners talk a lot about like community and better way of life and all of these things. Well, these are important conversations to keep in mind, and these are the types of conversations I hope we'll be having more and more once we get to a place in this nation globally where people accept Bitcoin is here. Okay, now that it's here, what is the best way we can use this as a tool for humanity, for our planet, for these things, right? We're still not there yet. And, we're still getting there. Some people are, but many aren't. But I look forward to getting to that place so we can have these conversations, rather than people saying, well, no, don't talk about that, because then they'll just want to ban Bitcoin, right? It's like, no, we have to talk about these things. Like, this is important to do.
Yeah, it's important to have these conversations, because I think also if we can have these conversations, then it says that we're willing to work to try to keep Bitcoin around too, because you're taking a stance of absolutely no Bitcoin or absolutely Bitcoin, and neither of these
screw everything else.
Neither of these are going to meet in the middle. So you have to have a position that meets in the middle. That's like, okay, let's see, how can we make it better? How can we make this industry better so that you don't feel so threatened by it that you want to get rid of it? And and that kind of was my original motivation when I started speaking on Twitter Spaces in 2021, and was just saying, it's probably a good idea to just accept that you need to deal with climate change. Climate change is real. And how can Bitcoin mining play a role in making that happen? Making climate change less of a problem or being part of the solution. How can Bitcoin be part of the solution? And those are some of the earliest things that I was saying in these Twitter spaces, aside from fighting with anarcho-capitalists. But, that I remember saying stuff like that and actually getting responses like, yeah, you're right. This is a good policy position. And I think that that's a really important narrative shift, and a way that I thought that we could meet people where they're at and say, yes, and yes, we agree. Climate change is bad. We need solutions. We need to reduce emissions. And here's how Bitcoin is working to make this happen. And now, that was in 2021. And now, fast forward 2023, we're getting papers that are like, yeah, Bitcoin could be good for the environment, could be good for renewable energy, like the Cornell paper. So
yeah.
yeah, so
And
now
that really,
we have to do
I'm
the
sorry,
same
go
thing.
ahead.
Oh no, I'm just saying, like we have to do the same thing with these other things. Like, yes,
Yeah,
you're right. Noise is a problem. And here's how we're going to solve it. Here's how
yeah,
we as an industry are going to come up with rules that will ensure that that new facilities we will keep their sound levels at this range within this
hmm
range or we're going to push within the industry for adoption of this type of cooling system that will not use fans at that make that much noise. I
yeah,
think these are the actual solutions rather than passing laws that tie people's hands and doesn't let them take action it, against a Bitcoin miner. So
yeah.
that's all I think is always going to be the solution for Bitcoin on the policy and community level.
Yeah, completely. And I think that's just going to aid it in being here, in continuing to win is having those conversations. Yeah, yeah. I wanted to I want to go back to it because I wanted to make sure to talk to you about this too before we wrap up. But you were talking about like Bitcoin will not go away, like Bitcoin being used by people who need to use it. And I want to mention because we haven't, I've shared it online. I've talked with friends offline about it as well, but haven't shared on the podcast yet. Talking about Youssef's Geyser Fund for Palestine, and I think for people to hear about this, I've told a lot of people about this. A lot of Bitcoiners know about it. I think it's one of the most popular Geyser Fund projects right now. And for those that don't know, Geyser Fund is basically like a GoFundMe for using Bitcoin, using Lightning. So we have a Geyser Fund for the podcast. A lot of different folks use it because it's just a great platform. The people running it are really great. It's censorship resistant for now. You can withdraw your Bitcoin and your Sats to your own custody and all of this. So I wanted to talk about that with you and just talking to let's imagine like just a normie is listening to this podcast and they don't really know much about Bitcoin. Like, why is something like a fundraiser, not even just like Geyser is the platform they're using, but Palestinians in the wake of this conflict and what's happening to them, utilizing Bitcoin to like fund basic services. And I'm smiling right now because just the thought of that, like that is what Bitcoin is for, right? In my mind, like that is what Bitcoin is for. This is a horrific conflict and horrific things are happening to families and to children and to all of these things. But Yusuf in this fundraiser, I'll actually just share my screen as well. So for folks watching on YouTube, at least, if you haven't, I mean, I'll share this again with this episode. But this is what the Geyser Fund looks like. I guess, yeah, that number there, 66 million sats
Can
donated
you
so
click
far.
on it and because it'll convert it into USD
Oh,
if you
I
tap.
was going to do
Yeah,
that. Okay.
yeah,
I mean, $28,000. I was actually going to go to a sats converter. So that's really funny.
it's right there.
But yeah, that's amazing. I mean, $28,000 just from people donating. You could see a lot of the donations are anonymous.
Yeah.
There's little like color boxes. Some will say like someone's username from like Nostr or something like this. But yeah, there's so much I could say on it. But I'll hand it over to you, Margot. What is something like this for someone who's just seeing this, doesn't know much about Bitcoin? What does this mean to you thinking about Bitcoin?
Well, I've tweeted it out a number of times and have said this is Bitcoin's most important humanitarian campaign. And I
Yeah.
think that's true. I don't think, I mean, on an individual scale and a dissonant scale, Bitcoin has been used in a number of ways. But here, we're in the middle of a war where innocent people are really cut off from the rest of the world. And we have an opportunity to help them with mutual aid
Mm,
directly. This is direct action. This is mutual aid. And we're doing it with people all over the world. It doesn't matter your local currency. Bitcoin is the universal currency. So if you
mhm,
can get Bitcoin, we can get Bitcoin to Yusuf, and then Yusuf goes and finds people who hold Bitcoin and have shekels and want to take Bitcoin in exchange. And there's money exchangers in Gaza still. These are, I think he's just going peer to peer, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
And this is fundamentally the way that Bitcoin was designed to work, peer to peer. He's not going through a central exchange. He's not even going through a decentralized exchange like BISC. He's literally going person to person, and we're
Mm-hmm.
able to do that with Geyser. And I think that's phenomenal. It's fantastic. And it's not something that we could have easily done any other way. We would have had to have gone through an NGO, which exists and who are, NGOs have been raising money, but we don't know how that funding is being distributed or if it's even getting into Gaza because, we definitely know that, for example, UN trucks are having a really hard time getting into Gaza to bring essential resources. And here we can give money directly and empower Yusuf directly to go out and buy the products that are out there, because even if this stuff is imported, it still costs money.
Mm-hmm.
It's not being given to them for free necessarily, right? He had to pay for a cow. They literally bought a cow, butchered it on the spot, and he distributed the meat to families who have literally been living off of a piece of bread a day or an orange. I've seen somebody on Instagram say, like, this was my breakfast. So, and it's, had like some fuzzy whiteness on it. And she was just like, this is all I can do. And that's the reality. But it's still, things still cost money, and prices are inflated because demand is high and there's not a lot of supply. And the economics still work the same in a war zone. So the fact that he can get money and be able to buy things and distribute it, like water, food, diapers, clothing for children. This is truly, I think, what Bitcoin was designed to do. It's getting through to people who need it. It's going around financial barriers. And it works so long as he can get internet reception, even though it's really spotty. He can just find a location somewhere in Gaza where he can finally get that internet reception and move that Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And I think, what is more powerful than that? What is a better example of Bitcoin's purpose than this humanitarian campaign in Gaza right now? And I think, regardless of your political views on Hamas or Israel, Netanyahu, I think that we can all see that there are people who are suffering needlessly in a war that they are not responsible for. These people are not Hamas. These children who have been killed and murdered by the bombing, they're not responsible for this. And here's this guy who's not responsible for Hamas. He's not responsible for this war. Just trying to do a good thing in a very, very difficult situation, one that none of us could even imagine living through, and let alone, for a day, or let alone for 60 plus days where there's no hospital, the hospital system the healthcare system has collapsed. Your home has been turned to rubble. People are dying every day. It's just horrific. There's infectious diseases spreading now. It's a horrible situation, and we have to remember that these are human beings. They're just like us. They have hopes and dreams. They want to live their life in peace, just like us. And these are all the fundamental things that people want, I think. And we should keep that in mind, that there are humans on the other side, and that we can do something good. And Bitcoin is truly doing something powerful here. So I really hope that your viewers, Trey, will also consider sending some of their Satoshis to Yusuf's campaign, because it really is an exemplary model for what Bitcoin is truly capable of doing. It's not the speculation. It's not the ETFs. honestly, it's not the Bitcoin miners and, what they're doing, whether they're balancing the grid or not, whether they're using fossil fuels or not. All that is secondary to the social value of Bitcoin. And this is a prime example of the best of Bitcoin's social value.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I hope people just play that on repeat in terms of like, number one thing that brought me into Bitcoin was like human rights stuff. And there is nothing compared to it. There really isn't. Like you talked about the NGO stuff. What's complicated in this, and the NGOs serve a really important purpose in so many conflicts, like the history of the United Nations NGO or their NGO services and things like that are really good and valuable. I'm not saying those things should go away
Yeah.
like overnight or anything, but what happens is, these different roadblocks that come up, like metaphorically and physically. And you have nation states that have to talk about when do we let NGOs in and when do we not? Like those are barriers to access, right? And a lot of times the NGOs are just they might be headed in, and then there's a barricade of military officials saying you can't go in, right? So then that is cut off. But Bitcoin is borderless, like in every sense of the word, right? So I don't want to overstate. I think there's some places where Bitcoin is it is literally capable in terms of the network, but there's not a buyer or there's not a trader or there's not a particular market. But these are some of the first places where this is going to play out, where they're going to figure it out because where there's a will, there's a way. And right now, people are like, we're starving. What are the ways to figure this out and get aid? So a lot of these places, you talk about the global south, Palestine, Lebanon, there's so many other places where they were some of the earliest adopters of using Bitcoin in peer-to-peer ways that most Americans like, we don't need it, right? Like we don't need it in that way. We have PayPal, Venmo, whatever. Um, these folks need it. And in some situations, I don't have specific data, but in some situations, it's like the difference between whether a family like eats that week or not in terms of like $28,000, like Yusuf's posting updates on Twitter and other platforms, just like photos of handing out grocery bags and food and things like this. Like you're seeing food disbursements from this fundraiser. It's really brilliant. So definitely would echo that, encourage people to check out the Geyser Fund. Learn how to send sats. If you don't know, this is a good first way to do it. There's Cash App, there's Strike. I'll be sure to add some other resources too from just ways that you can actually send Bitcoin if you've never done that before. Learn how to do it with this Geyser Fund. That would be really fun and a really cool way to be like, that was my first Satoshi sent was for like a fundraiser to help feed families, even when like UN trucks can't get in. Like that's pretty powerful. That's I think that's dangerous to authoritarian regimes, which people have known for a while. It's so powerful for like everyday people. Like it's absolutely incredible. So I'm glad we touched on that as well. And fortunately, unfortunately, I'm glad it exists. Like it shouldn't need to, but I'm glad these things exist. And the folks at Geyser have just been doing such a great job of like Bitcoin's going to be donated and supported and Sats used regardless of whether Geyser Fund is there or not. It's like a company and a platform. They've done such a good job of connecting like us Westerners to projects like this, right? Like people like to, people in the West, I think it comes from a good place, right? Like crises happens. And then a lot of people in the West are like, I want to donate. I want to support. What do I do? Celebrities post links to donate to this and that. It'll be really interesting to see one day celebrities posting like Geyser Fund links for people. It's not as easy to, you can't shut down like a Bitcoin address in the same way as you can like a GoFundMe project, right? If someone wanted to go after it in different ways, like if Geyser Fund stopped working tomorrow, Yusuf could still take Bitcoin donations and get the word
Right.
out in peer-to-peer ways, which is incredible.
Yep. I mean, and I think he also has a wallet of Satoshi address as well.
Yeah,
So there's multiple ways that you can send him Bitcoin. It's powerful.
yeah,
It's really powerful. You don't need the third party like Geyser, but it helps.
yeah.
So it's cool that it's there. And I mean, talking about Venmo really quick, I was able to raise money within my own network, and I told them, well, it's Bitcoin, but you don't have to have Bitcoin. Just send me dollars. I'll
That's
buy the
very true.
Bitcoin and I'll
Yeah.
send it. And
Mm,
that's what I did. And I just took screenshots and sent it to them, just
yeah.
so they could see that all the transactions
Oh,
happened
that's such a common
and
sense. That's a cool
that
way
I
to
made
do
the
it.
donation for them.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's one way to do it. And he's like, for people who don't really know anything about Bitcoin, but still care about supporting this campaign. You just need one person who is trusted in your network to give them the dollars or whatever, and then have them go buy the Bitcoin and send it.
Yeah.
So that worked. I was able to do that. I was really happy that I could do that.
That's awesome.
It's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, that's a really good, it's times of crisis, but these hopeful messages of what Bitcoin's actually doing that I'm like, this is what Bitcoin's here for. And I've had a couple of friends that I've talked to, and they've just heard a couple of these human rights stories. Like I've mentioned, like Farida's story in Togo, and then this story in Palestine. There's other stories of Afghanistan women, like so many couple of stories, and it makes people be like, oh, cool. I've had some friends be like, oh, sweet. Why are they trying to why don't they like Bitcoin then? It's kind of like once you hear some of these things, you're like, regardless of what else Bitcoin can or can't do, that alone isn't that pretty worth it? Isn't that pretty worth it? So I think it's just, I try not to underestimate how many folks need to just continue hearing these stories that don't know about it, and just talking about that a lot more for Western audiences or all audiences to say, this is why Bitcoin, yeah, sure, number go up, whatever, but this is why Bitcoin, this is the reason we're here.
Yeah. And also great environmental, but this is the most important thing.
Yeah.
At least for me, which, maybe it's unexpected, but really the most important thing about Bitcoin to me is its social value. And I think, we have to work to make sure Bitcoin also does good things. These second order effects are really cool within renewables and landfill mining and whatever. But, in an emergency, the most important thing is to help people and to empower them. And the other stuff is not as important. So I like to keep that in mind and make sure that the social value is, that we really understand that is truly what matters the most about Bitcoin.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. Margot, you give me so much to think about always. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for coming out of your research cave to
Thank you.
to do this. I think a lot of people will really enjoy this conversation. Is there anything else you want to fill people in on, or send them to in terms of different resources? Like I know you've got your X channels and all of that. We'll include that stuff. But anywhere else you'd like to send people to?
Not right now. Everything that I'm working on is behind schedule. So hopefully in the coming months, we'll start seeing more things published with my name on it.
Awesome.
And getting out there. I'll be in Madeira in March at that conference.
Oh, cool. The Atlantic? Wait.
Yeah,
Atlantis
Atlantis.
one? Yeah.
Or whatever. Yeah.
Cool.
So I'll be there. And I think I'll be at other conferences. I mean, April BPI is having its policy summit, second annual policy summit. I think in July is the Nashville Bitcoin conference. So no more Bitcoin Miami, it's Bitcoin Nashville next year. So I have some conferences lined up, at least tentatively. And so, say hi to me if you're at those conferences. Cool. But yeah, Twitter is always the best way to find me. As always, Jen Urso.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for your Nostr renaissance. Maybe when you have some downtime.
Nostr. I know. I'm on.
No, it's hard. It's there's so many different things to use. You got to think about different audiences, so many things. But
I've not even been that much on Twitter either because I've been so busy and trying to focus on that. And as much as engagement is great for number go up on followers, it's
not really great for some other things.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know how Troy manages it, but he's very good at balancing that with all of his work. And I think it takes me a lot longer to come up with something as clever as he does to say on Twitter. So I just step back a bit.
Right.
But yeah, I need to refocus on Nostr. I'm on there though, somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, you do. You have an NPub. Yeah.
I do have an NPub. You can ask me for it on Twitter, and I can send it to you.
Cool. All right, Margot, thank you so much for this conversation. Good luck, and we'll chat again soon.
Thanks for having me. It's always great to be on your show.